Okay, good evening, everyone, and sorry for the slightly late start. I've posted in the chat, for those who didn't manage to see it, the link to the download for this week. But before I say anything else, I want to just say how nice it is to be back into the regular cycle of shiurim after having had a break over Nissan and then the Yom season over the last week. So it's nice to be back to the regular routine of the shiurim. This shiur is dedicated in memory of Shoshana Feiga Bas Chaim Yitzchok, Mrs. Shoshana Kahan, who passed away tragically at a very young age last week. She was an exceptional lady who, amongst many other things, was renowned for the quality of the advice that she gave, and was someone who was a port of call to many people in need of support and advice and eitzah. She was in particular involved in counselling young couples who were going out, dating, shidduchim, and the like. And I think it's most appropriate that this shiur is on the topic of Lifnei Iver, lo sitting michshol, in front of a blind person. One should not put a stumbling block, which, as we will see, is understood to include the concept of giving bad advice and a caution about how careful and conscious one has to be of giving good advice. And she was someone who really excelled in this. Her advice was never driven by a personal agenda. It was never driven by anything but the best interests of those who were speaking to her. And I hope this shiur is a fitting means of remembering her and is offered le'iloi nishmasa. So the topic of Lifnei Iver lo sitting michshol, which we will look at inside in a few moments, is a very significant one. The area of being careful about advice that we give is clearly one that's a constant in our lives. We constantly speak to people, whether these are members of our family, whether these are acquaintances and friends, whether these are business colleagues or people with whom we trade, and being conscious of the advice we give is an important one. But it takes particular halachic significance given, as we will see, that Chazal understand this to include not causing or enabling or facilitating someone else to sin. If we look at the pasuk, which I've printed on the handout, the pasuk says, Lo sekalel cheresh, which we're not going to talk about, do not curse a deaf person. And then it says, V'lifnei iver, lo sitting michshol, in front of a blind person, do not put a stumbling block. V'yoresa me'elakacha ani Hashem, be fear in awe of God, because I am Hashem. I note that I've used the full name of Hashem here. So those of you who have this on your screen, it's not a problem, but for those of you who have printed it, I don't want to transgress putting a stumbling block in front of you and cause you to discard the name of Hashem. So if you did print it, please make sure you discard it in Shemus. I should have been more careful. Now, what does it mean, don't place a stumbling block in front of a blind person? Says Rashi in a famous comment, Lifnei hasuma b'dova, in front of someone who is metaphorically blind, lo sitting eitzah she'ena haganaslo, do not give advice which is inappropriate. Al toma mechor sodcha v'kach l'chol chamor, don't give advice in business matters, for example. Again, for those who don't have it, I've put the link in the chat function. For those, don't be careful when you give business advice that you don't advise someone misleadingly. Carries on Rashi, v'yoresa me'elakacha, you should fear God. Why does the pasuk say in front of a blind person, do not put a stumbling block, and you should fear God? So Rashi says, v'yoresa me'elakacha is a term used whenever something isn't apparent and obvious to the external observer. This week we will be reading two sedras, Acharei Mot-Kedoshim. This is a pasuk taken from the second of the two sedras Kedoshim, and the phrase "V'yoresa me'elakacha ani Hashem," stand in awe of God because I am Hashem, is one that occurs many times in the sedra and indeed in many other places throughout the Torah. And Rashi has a general thesis that whenever this phrase occurs, it's referring to something where one might be tempted to ignore this prohibition because the normal social pressures of external action and reaction don't apply. What is the motive to obey this commandment? Only an inner yiras shamayim. And therefore Rashi is bothered. Surely putting a stumbling block in front of a literal blind person is both externally apparent and visible, and a terrible thing, something that everyone will understand is a terrible thing to do. And therefore Rashi understands that the pasuk is metaphorical. It's not referring to someone who does the physical action of placing a stumbling block in front of someone. Of course, this is something that one shouldn't and wouldn't do, and it's something that's externally observable. It refers to someone who, in a more subtle and nuanced and invisible way, misleadingly advises someone. So says Rashi on the pasuk. Now, in addition to misleading and false advice, the Gemara also understands this to refer to someone who causes or enables or facilitates someone in sinning. Such a person is also an Iver, even if they are conscious but disinterested in the fact that what they're doing is a sin. They are blinded to the spiritual consequences of their misdemeanor. And therefore the Gemara understands that the prohibition of Lifnei Iver lo sit in Michshol, in front of a metaphorically blind person, do not place a stumbling block, refers also to causing or enabling or facilitating someone to do an Aveira. So this is the topic of today. And in a switch from our normal format, both the Parsha and the Halachic section will address this topic, because it's both has profound Mussar and philosophical implications, the care and caution that we need to take with how we advise, or God forbid misadvise people, and our engagement and perhaps accidental promotion of sin is something we have to be conscious of. And it's also a very significant halachic area. And therefore, I'm going to dedicate both halves of the shiurim to this topic, looking at this cohesively as one whole, both in terms of the content of the Sedra and the halachic applications of this. And I have to say that this is an area that has enormous halachic ramifications, and a significant part of regular shilas and questions that are asked are connected to this very topic. Indeed, in a few moments, we'll see the language of the Rambam, who unusually comments on this prohibition, that Devarim Rabim Ma'od. This prohibition includes many, many things, very many things. Devarim Rabim Ma'od. This is a very broad prohibition, because if we just think about it for a few moments, it includes bad advice in general, and it includes the prohibition against causing others to sin. So in essence, if there's 613 mitzvahs and aveiros, there's 612 other about which this prohibition applies. So in the language of the Rambam, this applies to Devarim Rabim Ma'od, to an enormous number of scenarios. It's a very, very important halachic area to be conscious of, and therefore appropriate for us to dedicate some time to. Now, what are the sort of scenarios that we might want to think about? A vast array, and the number are really countless. Are we allowed to, if we're stopped in the street on Shabbat, and a Jewish driver, asks us which way to go, are we allowed to give them directions? Or are we facilitating them driving on Shabbos? Can we indeed step into the road on Shabbos and cause a driver to stop? May one sell, if one has a business, may one sell non-kosher food to Jews who are sadly not keeping the rules of kashrus? In fact, can I even give food to someone who isn't aware of halacha, if I will, in so doing, cause them not to make a bracha on the food? Carers who care for elderly relatives, for parents, or do so professionally, can confront this shaila when their parent or the elderly person they're caring for is not halachically observant, and perhaps wishes to send them to buy or purchase or cook for them non-kosher food. So these are a vast array of questions that apply. And then there's more subtle ones. Inviting someone to my home, or to a family simcha, or to the shul, when I know that it is likely that in so doing they will drive to the event. Is this a problem? Is this Lifnei Iver, lo sit in Michshol, causing someone to sin and facilitating this through my behavior. So these are some of the obvious ones that spring to mind. But then there are perhaps more subtle ones that spring to mind, more general ones that we can talk about, national ones that Israel needs to think about on a national level. A lot of debate in Israel is around its weapons industry. Is there a problem in Israel selling weapons to clients, some of whom may use or misuse or abuse these halachas, misuse or abuse these weapons? Israel's armament industry is necessary for its survival and for its protection, and in order to develop it, it needs to be able to sell it to customers. Is this appropriate for Israel to do in the context of Lifnei Iver, Lo Sitin Michshol, facilitating and encouraging sin? And then, as I said, there are more subtle examples. Imagine, for example, a travel agent who is asked to book tickets for a client to fly. And the client, Mr. Cohen, turns to the travel agent and says, I would like to fly on Saturday morning to arrive at my destination. Is this Lifnei Iver, Lo Sitin Michshol, in so doing? Can an estate agent show a property or facilitate the rental of a property to someone when the property might be used for inappropriate activity, or even just a mezuzah may not be put up on the door? Can an owner of a hall rent the hall out to functions that won't be run in line with halacha? So there's a vast array of questions that spring to mind when one considers the implications of Lifnei Iver, Lo Sitin Michshol, not placing a stumbling block in front of the blind. Now, why does the pasuk not mean literally don't place a stumbling block in front of the mind? So we already said that one possible answer is Rashi. Rashi says that whenever the pasuk tells us fear me, fear Hashem, this is indicative of the fact that this is an invisible sin, one that isn't apparent externally. The Rambam understands that Lifnei Iver, Lo Sitin Michshol can't mean just literally not placing a stumbling block in front of the blind. This would be excluded anyway and prohibited anyway due to numerous other prohibitions. For example, the pasuk says that Lo sosim domim b'veisecha, don't have a dangerous roof, for example, which is unfenced in your house. One should make a fence for the roof. If one has to have a fence for the roof, then kol v'chomer, much more so, one shouldn't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. This is the prohibition of mazik, of doing damage to other people, of lo samod al dam re'echa, not standing by idly over the blood of one's fellow. So of course it can't mean literally. This is already prohibited under numerous other prohibitions. So the pasuk is understood by Chazal to go further than literal placing of a stumbling block. There's an interesting discussion, by the way, amongst halachic authorities as to whether the pasuk still also means its simplest explanation. And this is a broader discussion, which really is a topic in its own right. We know that the Torah is understood on multiple levels. It's understood as Peshat, the simple meaning of the Psukim, and it's understood also on a deeper level in a Midrashic reading or a halachic reading, nuances of layer and depth to the meaning. So when we have a comment of the sages of Chazal who take a pasuk out of the simplest reading, which is don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind, and understand it to mean bad advice, or even going further than that, facilitating transgression, did they mean to say that it no longer should be understood at all in terms of its peshat, in terms of the simplest meaning of the pasukim? Chazal say, Ein mikra yotzi midei pshuto. Even when we add in nuances and depth and midrashic readings into psukim, we still need to understand them in a peshat way, in the simplest reading of the psukim. So does this pasuk also apply to simply offering someone bad advice, or simply causing someone to physically stumble by placing a block in front of them, or has it shifted and moved over to the realm of causation of sin as per the extended meaning of the pasuk? So this remains somewhat of a machlokus. This is an area that's not completely resolved in halacha, and the Minchas Chinuch, for example, is of the view that if one literally puts a stumbling block in front of the blind, this pasuk is of no relevance. It would certainly be prohibited. The prohibition would be causing damage to other people. It would be a breach of another pasuk in the Seder of a hafton re'echa kamocha, treating people decently. But this wouldn't be the prohibition of Lifnei Iver, Lo Sitin Michshol. The Totamima, on the other hand, argues that this isn't the case. He says, of course, this means also a literal application of placing a stumbling block in front of a person, and it means the additional layers of meaning, but shouldn't be understood to take away from the simplest level of meaning. The Rambam, in his Sefer HaMitzvos, which I referenced already, and this is the second source on the source sheet, understands the pasuk, as I said, to only be referring to giving bad advice or causing someone to transgress. However, he seems to imply that the pasuk, this prohibition, does not include literally causing someone to stumble in a physical way, because this is anyway prohibited and wouldn't therefore be included in the pasuk. And as I said, he finishes off at the bottom of the quote by saying that there's devarim rabbi ma'od, there's many things which are included in the pasuk. So Rambam seems to understand that the pshuto shel mikra, the simple meaning of the verse, is bad advice, and the extended meaning of the verse is causing one to sin. But the simplest meaning of the pasuk does not include literally causing someone to stumble. There's, by the way, an interesting debate about causing someone to do an issa d'rabbanon, rabbinic prohibition. So, does Lifnei Iver forbid only facilitating a Torah prohibition, or even a rabbinic prohibition? So Tosa says it forbids even facilitating a rabbinic prohibition, and the Rambam Nachmanides argues, and he says no, the Torah prohibits Torah prohibitions Lifnei Iver, and doesn't prohibit if one facilitates the breaking halacha with a rabbinic prohibition. Now, this is very difficult to understand, and indeed there is a third viewpoint, the Ran Rabbi Nissim from Spain, who argues that if you cause someone to transgress a rabbinic prohibition, the one who causes them to transgress the rabbinic prohibition has transgressed the Torah prohibition of giving bad advice, of putting a stumbling block in front of someone who doesn't understand the consequences of what they do. So there's a paradox over here, that the principal transgressor has transgressed a rabbinic prohibition, but the person who facilitated it and caused them to do so has transgressed a Torah prohibition of giving them bad advice or leading them to stumble over something of significance, the prohibition of Lifnei Iver lo sitein michshol. So this brings out this sort of dimension, this interesting relationship, responsibility for others, which seems to imply that the prohibition against Lifnei Iver could include general bad advice, and therefore would include not causing someone to transgress an Issa D'Rabbanan, and according to the Ran, would be responsible for that even on a Torah level. Now, the implications of this are a little difficult. What, as I said, are the boundaries of responsibility we have for others, and particularly in an age like nowadays, where we value that which is autonomous, that which is that we value autonomy, we value independence, we value our ability to make our own decisions, we respect that others come to different conclusions to us, and live in a world in which there's a multiplicity of perspectives. How would this play out in the context of these applications or in halacha? By the way, I should mention that it is possible that this prohibition also applies to the practices of the non-Jewish world. This isn't the topic for today, but we know that there are the so-called Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 7 prohibitions which apply to B'nai Noach. And the truth is, these are in a sense categories of prohibitions. They're not really 7, and when you add up the maths, there's about 60 mitzvahs, around a quarter of all mitzvahs which are applicable to Jews, understood to apply to non-Jews. But there's 7 broad categories of prohibition, the 7 Noachide commandments. But for example, one of them is honesty in monetary matters, not to steal, and under that would fall perhaps 10 or 15 transgressions around the area of honesty in monetary matters. Now, what would be the halacha in terms of causing a non-Jew to sin, causing a non-Jew to transgress Lifnei Iver? Would this even apply do we have a responsibility even in front to a non-Jew not to cause them to sin? And there are many halachic authorities that consider the prohibition of Lifnei Iver to apply also to a non-Jew. After all, the pasuk is telling us a basic responsibility we have to others, not to cause someone to stumble. And there's nothing in the pasuk which seems to indicate that this is something which is a unique responsibility that we pay only to Jews, or even rather than only to no indication that this is something unique to Jews, and rather it would seem to include even non-Jews in this prohibition. There are some levels of mutual responsibility that are considered unique to Klal Yisrael. A higher level of ethical and moral sensitivity, which is part of a sort of social contract of being part of one people, and therefore wouldn't necessarily be a broader responsibility. But Lifnei Iver lo sitin mishol, there's no indication in the pasuk that this is a unique responsibility to Jews, and therefore one would certainly have to be careful not to offer false or misleading or negative advice to a non-Jew. But the Gemara in Avodah Zarah seems to imply that this would also extend to causing a non-Jew to sin, even though in their own eyes this isn't a sin. So the Gemara discusses the concept of Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah is forbidden to non-Jews. There are non-Jews who choose to be pagans and engage in it. And the Gemara says one shouldn't facilitate and assist a non-Jew to, chas v'shalom, God forbid, sin and transgress the Noachite commandment of Avodah Zarah. And therefore the Gemara says that one would have to be careful not to sell animals that might be used in sacrificial ritual, and so on and so forth, where the prohibition of Avodah Zarah would apply. So this is another scenario where we need to question what are the parameters of Lifnei Iver in the context of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, of the 7 Noachite commandments. For example, if I have a worker who asks me to pay him a fee and asks for cash only, so or perhaps says there'll be a reduction if I pay only in cash. So there's a number of questions around this sort of practice, including my own responsibility in Din and Malchusa, the law of the land. But even if assuming that I don't have a personal responsibility, but I'm causing them to transgress a prohibition, would this be a problem? Or let's take a simpler example where it's not even about tax, but it's literally about theft. An employee of a company who says, if you pay me directly and they avoid paying their commission to the company, whatever it is, you'll get a reduction. Again, is this an issue of Lifnei Iver? By the way, I should mention that this also applies when one is a dealer in stolen goods. If one suspects that the goods one is purchasing have been given with a nod and a wink, and they've been received off the back of a lorry, so in that case, I'm facilitating and enabling the thief, the ganav, who has stolen the food, and the item that they've stolen, and by buying it off them, I'm facilitating the theft that they have done. The Gemara says, lo ganva. It's not just the thief who steals. It's not just the achbar that steals. No achbar gonif. It's not just the rat or the mouse that steals, but chura gonif. It's the hole that steals. In other words, a mouse couldn't steal the piece of cheese unless it had a hole to retreat to, in which it placed the piece of cheese that it's stolen. This is the poetic language the Gemara uses to express the idea that the person who receives stolen goods is also an accomplice with the thief, and that there's this potential issue of Lifnei Iver lo sitin mishol in this case. So this is the introduction to the concept of Lifnei Iver lo sitin mishol. On the simplest level, it means literally a physical stumbling block. Is this the pshat in the pasuk or not? Unclear. Does the pasuk is the true pshat in the pasuk bad advice? And finally, the extension, which Chazal understood to be a Torah prohibition, to enable or facilitate someone to transgress something and sin and do an aveira. So the Gemara discusses the parameters of Lifnei Iver lo sitin mishol, and there's several sugyas in Shas that deal with this topic, and I just want to mention a couple of them. Those that sort of can be used to enlighten us a little bit to the parameters of this. One example of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitin Mechshol, says the Gemara, is the prohibition to hit a child, an older child, in the name of chinuch, in the name of education. So I'm not going to discuss the correct and appropriate means of education and whether a parent smacking a child is ever appropriate or not. In general, this is probably educationally poor practice. But the Gemara says certainly when it gets to an older child, this is prohibited because of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitin Mechshol. What will be the consequence of hitting the child? The child might hit back, which is a terrible avera, a terrible sin, or it may cause the child in general to remove themselves from a Torah life, and therefore the Gemara says that hitting a child who is an older child is a prohibition of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitin Mechshol. Now, this is an extension of Lifnei Iver. I'm not directly facilitating or enabling the sin. Nonetheless, the Gemara says that my behavior is causing this to occur, and therefore this is within the transgression of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitin Mechshol. Another example the Gemara gives is a Gemara in the Dorim, in which Rav Ashi used to, apparently he was a wood dealer, and he used to sell wood. And he was challenged by his critics, who said, you're selling wood to people who could use it for idolatry, to burn sacrifices or build bonfires in honor of their pagan worship. And Rav Ashi's response was that I don't need to worry about this. I don't need to assume this is what people are using it for. Most people buy wood for heating, and therefore I don't need to be concerned about this. Now, what does this seem to indicate? First of all, it's another example of Lifnei Iver in the context of non-Jews, but also it seems to indicate that selling something perfectly innocuous and innocent, which could be used or misused for a negative purpose, is also included in the prohibition of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitin Mechshol. In other words, it doesn't just mean supplying something which intrinsically is problematic, like, for example, non-kosher food, but it means even providing something which is neutral but could be used for something problematic, would seem to be also included in the prohibition of the Gemara. Unless it's neutral, there's no particular reason to assume it'll be used negatively or positively, and therefore it's not my concern. So, for example, if someone is a car dealer, they don't have to worry if their client may end up driving the car on Shabbos, because the car is a perfectly neutral, innocent object. People can choose to use it for negative purposes, whether that's to drive dangerously and risk their lives or the lives of others, or whether it's to drive on Shabbos and transgress a prohibition. And that's not my concern. I'm selling something which is perfectly innocent, whether it is used or misused by the person. However, if I'm selling something which has within it the propensity for misuse, and that's a significant risk, and therefore something that I ought to think about, then the concern of Lifnei Iver would apply. So we mentioned, for example, sales of weapons, being an arms dealer or the like, and this is something that Israel's engaged in a lot of discussion internally about the appropriateness and to what degree it has to worry about the people it's selling to. The love of Lifnei Iver when it comes to weapons, which aren't in and of themselves innocuous, but are clearly and directly things which are used for potentially negative purposes, it would seem therefore that the love of Lifnei Iver would impose some requirement of due diligence to check whether the buyers, whether the purchasers are a reputable democratic government that will use it for legitimate self-defense and law and order, or whether this could be misused by criminals or gangsters or despotic regimes that are going to use these for negative purposes, which maybe would be a problem of Lifnei Iver. Now, the most famous source on this whole topic is a continuation of the Gemara in Avodah Zarah that speaks about the scenario of a Nazir. And a Nazir is someone who takes upon themselves the commitment to obey the higher standards of Nazirus, including, amongst which is included the prohibition of yayin, of drinking wine. So the Gemara discusses a scenario where a Nazir says to another person, can you pass me that wine? Can you pass me that glass of wine? And the Gemara says it depends on the setup. If this is Shnei Avra Denara, if this is two sides of the river, in other words, the Nozi is unable to access the wine because he's on one side of the river and the wine is on the other side of the river, or to put that differently, he needs me or she needs me to pass the wine in order for me to transgress, in order for them to be able to drink it and thus transgress their Nazirus vow, then I wouldn't be allowed to pass it because of Lifnei Iver lo sitein mirshal. However, in a situation in which it is chad avrodanara, it's one side of the river, meaning to say that the Nazir could have got the wine themselves, and it was just a matter of convenience that they asked me to pass it to them. In that case, the Gemara says that Lifnei Iver lo sitein mirshal wouldn't apply. So this is one very famous limitation on the prohibition of Lifnei Iver lo sitein mirshal, which the Gemara understands it's only in a situation where they couldn't have managed to do it even by them, couldn't have managed to do it by themselves. That means to say, to put this, to sharpen the formulation, Lifnei Iver isn't assisting someone to sin. Lifnei Iver is enabling someone to transgress, where they couldn't have done it without me. It's not just facilitating the transgression, it's enabling the transgression. Were it impossible for them to transgress without me, then I am enabling and facilitating it. If they could have done it without me, then I'm merely assisting and making this possible, making this more convenient. This wouldn't be included in the love of Lifnei Iver lo sitein mirshal. So would appear to be the conclusion of the Gemara. Now, despite the clarity of this sort of formulation, it is a little bit hard to define one side of the river and two sides of the river. And I just want to mention a couple of examples just to bring this out. Is this dependent, and Rashi seems, by the way, to understand the Gemara to be saying this, that it's just dependent on whether the person could do the Aveira, could do the transgression without my assistance or not? Or would it even be if I'm making it easier for the person? So if I'm helping them by making it easier, then maybe that's enough. And maybe that's also called me facilitating. So if it's just a casual passing of something, the Gemara says that's not Lifnei Iver because the person could have reached it themselves. But if those have had to hassle themselves to go into it, then maybe this would be included also in Lifnei Iver. The Meiri, who speaks about this Gemara, he questions the exact formulation. So for example, taking this into a practical example, if someone says, can you pass the bottle of wine from the other end of the table, that would clearly not be included in the problem of Lifnei Iver, in the prohibition of Lifnei Iver, because they're able to do it very easily by themselves. However, if someone says, can you go shopping for me, where there's a degree of effort involved, and me doing so makes it easily available for them, then maybe this would be included in Lifnei Iver. And the rationale is that things which are hassle, people often end up not doing. So if I wouldn't have gone out and bought it for them, then maybe they wouldn't have had this particular meal, maybe they'd have had something else, and therefore I'm facilitating in doing it. What happens if they don't own it and they would have to go and buy it? So just the purchase itself, even without hassle, maybe this is enough. So how exactly we define Lifnei, one side of the river versus two, is a little unclear. There's a similar debate about what would happen if they can't do it themselves, but there's another available assistant who could have done it for them. So let's say I am a shopkeeper and I sell all sorts of food, including non-kosher food. Or I'm a travel agent and my client, Mr. Cohen, wants to book a flight to fly on Saturday with me. And in so doing, I am facilitating their Chilul Shabbos. So do they need me to do this? Well, the answer is they could do it themselves. So this isn't Lifnei Iver because they could do it themselves. This is Chad Avrodanara. But what happens, for example, if this is technical, this is complicated? It's something they couldn't do it themselves, but they don't have to go to me. They could go to another expert. They could go to another professional who could do it for themselves. And this is, for example, questions that lawyers sometimes face who are facilitating perhaps behavior of clients which in halacha isn't allowed. I'll give an example of this. A lawyer who is asked to draw up a contract where the contract includes a ribis clause, a payment of interest between two Jewish clients, Malva and Alova. Now, the details of this shaila are complicated, and therefore I'm not going to give a psak to this particular scenario, but just thinking this through, the client is not an expert. They're not able to draw up this contract themselves, and therefore ostensibly we may think this is like the scenario of two sides of the river. This is a situation where the person is unable to do the transgression themselves, and they need me to allow this to take place, and therefore perhaps this would be included in the prohibition of Lifnei Iver. On the other hand, it's true they need someone to help them, but if I were to refuse to help them, they would turn to someone else. There's plenty of lawyers around, and they could turn to someone else who would be able to facilitate this for them. And therefore the presumption would be that, again, this wouldn't be included in Lifnei Iver, because the exclusion from Lifnei Iver of them being able to do it without me applies to whether they could do it themselves or they could get someone else who is available to do it. So this is a very famous exclusion of Lifnei Iver, where this could be done by someone else, or they could do it themselves. Lifnei Iver applies to enabling. It doesn't just apply to merely assisting. So this is the core prohibition of Lifnei Iver. However, there is an additional rabbinic layer to this, possibly to this prohibition, which is known as misleading. Misleading means assisting or facilitating. So Lifnei Iver only means when there is a direct impossibility of them doing it, and I'm the one who's enabling this to take place, as we've just explained. However, D'Rabbanan, Chazal also forbade misleading, assisting someone to do an Aveira, even where they could have done it without me. And this is a paskens in Shulchan Aruch. This is paskens by the Ramah, who seems to say that there is a prohibition of misleading. There's a prohibition of enabling someone to do something, facilitating, assisting someone to do something, even if they are able to do so by themselves. Now, I'm not going to go into the full technical details of how the Ramah writes this, because there are contradictions in the language of the Rishonim when they talk about the parameters of the Issa of misleading. But it is clear that the extent of the rabbinic level of misleading is much more limited and doesn't apply in as many cases as Lifnei Iver. It's a prohibition against assisting, even when someone could have managed to do it without me. But nonetheless, there are limits to how far we extend this. And the background to this limit is that it would appear that the rabbinic prohibition of misleading is not an addition to Lifnei Iver lo sitin mechshol, placing a stumbling block in front of someone, because I'm not placing the stumbling block in front of them, because they could have done it even without me. What am I doing? I'm merely assisting them. What would be the problem of assisting them? That I am complicit in the Aveira that's being done. So Lifnei Iver lo sitin mechshol, placing the stumbling block in front of someone, is when I am causing them to do the sin. They couldn't have done it without me. And therefore, as the Gemara explains, if it's on one side of the river where they couldn't have done it, or it would have been much more difficult for them to do it without me, I am the one placing the stumbling block. Misleading is in a case where they could have done it without me, but I'm joining in the effort. I'm assisting them, even though it could have been done even without my assistance. And therefore, the prohibition of this has nothing to do with Lifnei Iver. I'm not placing a stumbling block in front of them. What is the prohibition? So in the same section of the Torah that we're talking about over in Kedoshim, the Pasuk also says there is a requirement, one should rebuke one's fellow. One should rebuke one's fellow if one sees them transgressing. Now, what does it mean to rebuke one's fellow? It means we have a general responsibility to try and care for each other's spiritual practice. Now, obviously, rebuke has to be done with sensitivity, and obviously in many situations it'll be counterproductive, and it depends on the nature of the relationship I have with the person, and whether it's practical and appropriate for me to comment, or whether indeed it would be helpful. Most often a positive engagement with people is the better way to do things, but in principle, a Pasuk in Kedoshim tells us that there is a responsibility we have, where possible, to cause others to desist from sin. And therefore the prohibition of misleading seems more to be linked to that. If I have an obligation to try and draw people close to mitzvah observance, whether through rebuke or through drawing them in and showing and sharing the beauty of Torah. How much more so, obviously, I can't actively be Messiah, I can't actively help and assist and become complicit in the breach of observance that is taking place over here. Now, if that's the source of the prohibition, then there are a number of limits to this. And one very important limitation to this is, it's amisecha. The mitzvah of hechiach techiach only applies to amisecha, to one's fellow. We already discussed that every time we look at social responsibility in the Torah, we need to analyze whether this is considered to be something which is applicable within Klal Yisrael, or whether it's something that's applicable even beyond in broader society. And a basic level of decency and care for all humans is obviously required within the Torah. And therefore, the mitzvah of Lifnei Iver, don't place a stumbling block in front of the blind, is one which is irrespective of whether one is from Yisrael or not, whether one is a Jew or non-Jew. This applies. We obviously can't cause anyone, any human being, to stumble. However, the mitzvah of hechiach techiach of rebuke, of responsibility, mutual responsibility for spiritual behavior, the obligation to draw someone near to closer to the observance of Torah and mitzvahs, this is a uniquely Jewish mitzvah. This is an obligation upon us as members of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, if the requirement of Messiah, the prohibition to help and support someone in sinning, that is, if it draws its source from the mitzvah of hechiach techiach, then that would be something that only applies to amisecha, to someone who is a member of Klal Yisrael. So this is an important limitation on this prohibition, that this one would only apply to someone who is a member of Klal Yisrael. It's possible also that it wouldn't apply to a serial transgressor, because the halacha, the translation of the word amisecha, is would seem to mean someone who is engaged in general Torah observation. Someone who is amisecha, someone who is, the literal meaning of amisecha is one's fellow practitioner. And therefore it would appear to apply only to someone who is a fellow practitioner in Torah. And therefore the prohibition of Messiah, again, may not apply to someone who is not a practitioner of Torah, and therefore one wouldn't have a responsibility there either to avoid facilitating, as long as one isn't enabling, as long as it's possible for this to have been done, irrespective of one's help. Now, the exact application of this in the 21st century to a world in which most people are not really conscious, those who are not keeping Torah mitzvahs are generally not conscious of the halachic system and don't have a full understanding of it, is a different matter, is a complex matter, exactly how one would apply that to actual application. But this is an important principle, because were this principle not to be the case, we would have all sorts of scenarios which would be very deeply difficult. We discussed this question about handing food to someone on a fast day. So you have it's Shiva Oster B'Tammuz, and a Jewish worker or plumber comes around to one's house to fix something up, or you have a meeting with a client, and they ask for a cup of water. They want a cup of water for a drink. Are you required to say, I can't hand this to you? It's true, you could get the water without me, and therefore this isn't the prohibition of Lifnei Iver lo sitin mechshol. I'm not directly causing you to stumble. Nonetheless, I'm Messiah. I'm complicit in this. I'm assisting you in this transgression. So if Messiah applies, then this may be indeed a problem. However, if the root cause of Messiah is hechiach techiach, is a general obligation to worry about spiritual observance of those who are engaged in mitzvah practice, and excludes those who are not engaged on a regular basis in mitzvah practice, then this wouldn't be an issue, and one would be allowed to do so. So this is an example of where the definition of the prohibition of Messiah would be a particularly important one. And this leads to a larger discussion about how we are meant to and how we can interact with friends and family who are not perhaps mitzvah observant, and we wish to invite them to our simchas, or we wish to invite them to have a Friday night meal with us, and through so doing might cause them, let's say, to drive on Shabbos or the like. So this is something extensively discussed by the poskim. How should one relate to such a situation, and what can one do? Can one invite someone, for example, to come to an event where one will effectively cause them to drive on Shabbos? So the stance of the poskim goes really here from one extreme to another. So let's try and analyze this based upon the principles that we've been speaking about. If the prohibition is Lifnei Iver lo sitin michshol, placing a stumbling block in front of someone, and that only applies to a case where someone wouldn't be able to do it without one. In this case over here, causing someone to drive on Shabbos, they would be able to drive irrespective of my invitation, and therefore this wouldn't appear to be the transgression of Lifnei Iver. On the other hand, is it Messiah? They could do it even without me, it's true, but we've seen that we're also not allowed to assist or share in doing this. So again, this wouldn't appear to be the case because I'm not directly assisting them. I'm merely inviting to my house. So Moshe Feinstein argues that this is a deeper concern. Here I'm actually encouraging, I'm causing it to happen. It's not someone saying to me, can I have this? Can you help me? And I'm assisting or facilitating, but I'm actually causing this to take place. So this may be an example in which it's actually worse than that. On the other hand, it would be untenable to be in a situation where we are unable to offer food to a guest, or unable to have any social interaction in such a manner. The Chil Hashem, the desecration that would be created by this, the lack of care and consideration that this would appear to involve, would seem to be very problematic. And there is an argument put forward by Moshe Sternbuch, one of the senior poskim of the Eidah Charedis, in which he argues that we need to look at the bigger picture. Lifnei Iver lo sitin michshol means don't place a stumbling block in front of someone, don't cause them to stumble. However, were I to desist from offering a drink to a thirsty worker on a fast day, or were I to cut off social contact with someone on Shabbos, the stumbling block I would be placing in the situation would be greater, because I would be causing the person to feel distanced from myself and from our relationship and from our a connection with our heritage, which imposes, in their view, this wholly mistaken application, which deprives them of the ability to have normal social contact with me and deprives them of the ability to interact. So each case really needs to be addressed on a case-by-case basis and looked at in the scenario itself and considered, actually, where is the greater michshol over here? What is the greater stumbling block that I'm causing? Because it could well be by applying Lifnei Iver lo sitin michshol more narrowly, I would actually cause a greater michshol, a greater stumbling block to be created by the distancing that this is creating in our relationship or in the interaction I have with others. So this is a second line of reasoning in which I am. We need to look in the bigger picture of what's going on rather than just looking at the narrowest application of the particular case that's involved. There is a more generic discussion over here, which may also be of relevance, and this is a fascinating halachic discussion about whether I am allowed to engage in a minor, relatively speaking, minor sin, a smaller avera, in order to help someone else avoid a more significant avera. So in Moshe Sternbuch's argument, he's arguing that the whole prohibition of Lifnei Iver lo sitin michshol doesn't make sense over here, because it means don't put a stumbling block in front of someone. In this particular case, the stumbling block isn't the specifics of this avera, but the larger effect this would create on the person and their relationship to me or the relationship to Torah. But there's another angle you can take, which is maybe even if there is a prohibition here of Lifnei Iver lo sitin michshol, nonetheless, I need to look at the greater damage that's being done, and it is appropriate and correct for me to engage in something which is a more minor prohibition in order to avoid someone else doing a more major prohibition, or to help someone do a more significant mitzvah. And this is discussed in a scenario in a Gemara in Shabbos. The Gemara discusses that a topic actually that next week we will resume when we go back to the halachas of Shabbos and cooking on Shabbos. It discusses the prohibition of cooking and baking on Shabbos, which will be our halachic matter when we next week resume the regular halachic series. And it talks about the particular situation of baking bread on Shabbos. So someone transgresses and puts bread into the oven on Shabbos. Now, it takes time for the bread to bake. When they first put it into the oven, it is raw dough, and for the first 10 minutes, quarter of an hour that's in the oven, it will remain raw and won't become significantly cooked. At some point in the process, after time has passed, 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, the dough will become somewhat baked, and at that point, the prohibition of Chil Shabbos would have been transgressed. So the question is, can I remove the dough from the oven on Shabbos in order to stop the dough baking and save the person who put it into the oven from the greater prohibition of cooking and baking on Shabbos? So I'll have done a more minor prohibition of removing the bread from the oven on Shabbos, which in the times of Chazal certainly was an Issa D'Rabbanan, because it was a skilled job. They used to slap the dough onto the side of the oven, and it was a skilled job to remove it. I would do the more minor prohibition of removing the dough from the oven on Shabbos in order to save someone from the greater prohibition of Chil Shabbos, or transgressing Shabbos, by baking the dough on Shabbos. So this is known in halachic literature as Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, sinning in order that someone else gets a benefit from it. Normally, the assumption is who would sin to save someone else from getting a benefit. However, in a situation of saving someone from a more significant aveira, perhaps this is allowed. This has entered the halachic discussion on Shulchan Aruch from a tragic case discussed in a teshuvah of the Rashba. And this was a case in which a child was kidnapped. It would appear they were kidnapped by, in the name of Christianity, kidnapped by the church, and rescue efforts needed to be mounted in order to save this child. And this halachic discussion about chasing after this person to rescue them on Shabbos, and the parameters of what would be allowed, given that the life of the victim wasn't under any threat at all. The physical life was not under any physical threat at all, but the spiritual life was under threat. So effectively, I need to break Shabbos now in order to save the spiritual life of the victim who is going to be baptized in a forcible baptism. And this is again where there's a discussion around this idea of, am I allowed to do a relatively minor avera, perhaps in this context, the avera of riding on a horse on Shabbos to chase after the kidnapper, or going outside the tchum in order to save the spiritual life of the victim who is being pursued in this case. So this is another sort of discussion around the parameters of Lifnei Iver. What am I allowed to do? Is it ever appropriate to transgress Lifnei Iver in order to save someone from a bigger avera? And the halachic consensus is this is not appropriate to do. I can't transgress the prohibition in order to save someone else. But the halachic consensus is equally that in certain situations one can look at the bigger picture and say, actually, is the stumbling block caused by me including them, which may specifically therefore lead to them transgressing this immediate prohibition, or is the greater stumbling block the larger picture of the effect it will have on their relationship to halacha? There is a teshuvah, and I'll conclude with one final teshuvah. There is a teshuvah of Ramosha Feinstein that was addressed to Rabbi Zion Rakov, who was here in London. I don't know if any of you remember Rav Rakov, who I think he died in the 80s. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Chai Olam Yeshiva in Golders Green. And there's a tshuva of Ramosha addressed to him about a situation in which someone owned a function hall. And the function hall, the business model was that they would rent it out to renters. And the question was, to what degree does he need to be concerned about the use to which the hall would be put? And the first thing he says, applying the reasoning that we've used, is that this would appear to be Messiah not Lifnei Iver. This isn't a scenario of one side of the river, the two sides of the river. This is a scenario of one side of the river. London is a big city, and therefore other halls would be available. They don't particularly just need my hall. It's true my hall may be preferable and more convenient, but it's not absolutely vital, and therefore they could manage without me. So what am I? I'm a Messiah. I'm an assister rather than an enabler. As we've already seen, there's limits to how much the assistance is a concern and to what degree I have to worry about the practice of others, particularly when this is a regular feature of their life and it's an area of practice which they've disregarded. In addition, even though we saw that with Lifnei Iver, it may include selling an innocuous thing that could be misused. We saw that Rav Ashi was questioned about selling wood. Selling wood is perfectly innocent, but it could be misused as part of the pagan worship. And his response was, I have no reason to suspect this. Whereas over here, in the case of the person renting the hall, they may have reason to suspect that the hall is going to be used for something problematic. Nonetheless, since the hall in and of itself is an innocuous thing, it can be used appropriately or not. Therefore, Moshe's conclusion is that this is not problematic because it's an innocent thing that's being sold, and I am merely I'm merely renting it out and allowing them to do with what they want. So in brief, when one wants to think about a question of Lifnei Iver and Messiah, one needs to sort of go through the following process of considering it. The first thing is one needs to think about whether it is two sides of the river or not. In other words, could they do this without me, or do they need me? Could they do it easily without me? Could they not do it at all? Could they manage without my help? This would determine whether there is the Torah prohibition of Lifnei Iver. Then I need to think about the rabbinic prohibition of Messiah, of assisting. Is this someone in this case, is this someone who is Bichlal Amisecho? If the origin of this is the mitzvah of rebuke, is this someone who is genuinely observant of these practices or not? And am I directly helping them? Am I giving them something innocent which they can use or not use for something good? And am I directly helping them by so doing? In other words, will they directly misuse it, or perhaps just in the longer term? And finally, am I saving them from an even bigger prohibition by doing this smaller prohibition? And finally, I need to think through the bigger picture. What is the bigger relationship with this? And is it possible that the Lifnei Iver, the stumbling block, is by not doing this rather than doing this? In addition, I need to think, what is the prohibition that we're concerned with over here? How serious is that which they will do? Is it a deraisa? Is it a drabonon? Is it a Torah law or not? And is there this aspect of the general and holistic relationship? And probably in each case then that would need to be worked out and discussed on a case-by-case basis in order to have a psak. But this is a trace of the pasuk of Lifnei Iver lo sitin michshol, and some of the halachas is relevant. And as I said, one which the Rambam already points out leads to numerous shilas that need to be considered. So I'll stop here for today. As I said, this has interesting musa and philosophical applications, and also halachic ones. And next week we will go back to our normal format of a half an hour direct Parsha and half an hour Halacha. But for this week, these are the ideas that I wanted to share. And I see there's a couple of questions that have appeared on the chat, which I'm happy to take.